The elevator stopped between floors at 12:04 in the morning. Inside that glass and steel box, suspended 40 feet above the lobby of one of the most powerful corporate towers in the city, a desperate man pressed a knife against the air and screamed that he had nothing left to lose. Victoria Sterling, 30 years old, worth $9 billion, the CEO of Sterling Meridian Corp., stood perfectly still and looked through the glass wall of the shaft at the one person her entire security team had failed to notice. Not the director of security, not the tactical response officer, a maintenance worker in a gray uniform, pushing a mop cart across the lobby floor. His name was Caleb Mercer, and nobody in that building had ever really looked at him. Before we go any further, if stories like this one reach something inside you, something real, please take a second right now and hit that subscribe button. Every week I bring you stories about ordinary people who do extraordinary things when the world stops paying attention. Hit the like button if this one already has you hooked. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that lobby. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. The building was called Meridian Tower, and it was the kind of place that made people feel small on purpose. 72 stories of glass and reinforced steel rose above the financial district like a monument to ambition. The lobby alone was 3 stories tall, with marble floors so polished you could see your reflection walking beneath you, a ceiling made entirely of layered architectural glass, and a reception desk staffed by people who had been trained to smile exactly the right amount, warm enough to seem human, controlled enough to remind you that you didn't belong there unless someone had cleared your name. After midnight, most of the building slept. The trading floors above the 40th story had gone quiet 4 hours earlier. The legal department on 22 had powered down at 10. The cafeteria on 6 had been locked since 9:30, but the lobby never fully went dark. There were always lights, always cameras, always at least 2 security officers at the main desk, and always, somewhere in the background, Caleb Mercer. He had been working the night shift at Meridian Tower for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. He knew the exact schedule of every cleaning cycle in the building. He knew which elevator in the East Bank made a faint grinding sound on the descent between floors 14 and 12, a sound he had reported twice in writing and once in person to the facilities manager, who had nodded, said, "We'll get that looked at," and done nothing. He knew that the emergency lighting in the parking sublevel flickered for exactly 4 seconds after a power fluctuation before stabilizing, which meant there was a loose junction somewhere in the secondary circuit that nobody had bothered to trace. He knew these things because he paid attention, not because anyone asked him to. Because that was how Caleb Mercer moved through the world, quietly, carefully, noticing everything that everyone else walked past without seeing. He was 37 years old, average height, not particularly large, the kind of face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd, angular jaw, dark eyes that stayed still even when the rest of him was moving, a few lines at the corners that hadn't been there 5 years ago. His hands were rough in the way that came from actual work, not from a gym. There was a small scar along his left forearm that he never explained, and a habit of standing with his back to the wall when he was in a room full of people, which most people assumed was shyness. It wasn't shyness. It was something older than that, something trained. But Caleb had left that version of himself behind. He had buried it deliberately, carefully, the way you bury something you need to stop being before it costs you everything you still have left. What he still had left was Eli. His son was 7 years old, small for his age, with Caleb's same still dark eyes and his mother's laugh, wide and sudden and completely unguarded. Eli had been born deaf, which had surprised Caleb in the way that real surprises do, the kind that rearrange your assumptions before you even know they're happening. He had driven home from the hospital on a Tuesday afternoon in October, sat in the parking lot of his apartment complex for 45 minutes, and then went inside and started researching sign language programs. That was Caleb. He didn't spiral. He just figured out the next thing. He had learned ASL over the following 2 years with the same focused discipline he had once applied to things he no longer talked about. He practiced every night after Eli went to sleep. He made flashcards. He watched videos. He found a community class at a rec center 3 miles away and drove there every Saturday morning until he was fluent enough that the teacher pulled him aside and told him quietly that he had a gift for it. He hadn't known what to do with that information. He'd said thank you, driven home, and made Eli scrambled eggs. Now they communicated in a mix of sign and spoken word that was entirely their own language, a pidgin vocabulary of half gestures and shorthand that only the two of them fully understood. Eli had a way of signing, "Are you tired?" that involved one eyebrow raised and one hand tilted sideways, like a question that also contained its own answer. Caleb had a way of signing, "I love you" to his son that he'd never done in front of anyone else, because it felt private in the way that most important things are private. Tonight, Eli was home with Mrs. Okafor from 4B, who sat with him on Tuesday and Thursday nights, and charged Caleb $40, which he paid without negotiating because she was reliable, and Eli liked her, and reliability was worth more than money. Caleb had clocked in at 11:45, done his initial walkthrough of the lobby and the service corridor on the ground floor, and was working his way through the cleaning cycle near the east elevator bank when he heard the shouting start. He looked up. The private executive elevator, the one that required a key card and ran directly from the lobby to the executive floors without stopping, had gone dark. The display panel above the doors showed nothing, no floor number, no up or down arrow, and through the glass side panel of the elevator shaft, visible to anyone standing at the right angle in the lobby, Caleb could see the elevator itself. Stopped. Suspended between the first and second floor. Maybe 12 feet off the ground, maybe 15. The shouting was coming from inside it. Caleb set down his mop without making noise and moved closer, staying along the wall, angling himself toward the glass panel. He wasn't running. He wasn't hurrying. He was moving the way he used to move when moving too fast, was the difference between coming home and not. He could see 3 people in the elevator. One of them was a woman in a dark blazer, late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair pulled back and the particular kind of composure that comes from years of performing calmness, in situations where calmness is expected. She was standing near the back wall, her hands slightly raised, palms visible. Her posture said she was managing something. Her eyes said she was scared. One of them was a younger woman, early 20s, lower-level professional dress, a tablet clutched against her chest like it was a flotation device, pressed into the far corner with her face turned partially away. And one of them was a man Caleb didn't recognize. He was somewhere between 40 and 50, with the look of someone who had recently stopped sleeping regularly. Unshaven. Tie loosened to the point of hanging open. A jacket that had cost real money once and had been slept in recently. I was pacing in the small space of the elevator, 2 steps one direction, 2 steps back, and his right hand was wrapped around a folding knife with the blade extended. Not a large blade, maybe 3.5 inches. Caleb had learned a long time ago that the size of the blade was not the most important variable. The most important variable was the state of the person holding it. And this man was not in a controlled state. He was breathing in the sharp, shallow way that meant his body had taken over from his thinking, which meant anything could happen, and fast. The security team had arrived at the elevator doors. Grant Holloway, the building's director of security, was there with 2 of his overnight officers. Holloway was a large man, former city police, with a voice designed to project authority and a management style that relied almost entirely on volume and certainty. He was currently pressing his keycard against the elevator panel, which was doing nothing, and raising his voice to do the work his keycard wasn't doing. "Sir, put the knife down and step toward the doors. Nobody needs to get hurt here. This doesn't have to go anywhere bad. Put the knife down." The man in the elevator stopped pacing. He turned toward the voice. His grip on the knife tightened. Caleb watched the man's breathing accelerate. Wrong, he thought. Wrong approach. Wrong tone. Wrong everything. The woman in the dark blazer, the one with the composure, was watching the man in front of her. But Caleb caught something in her eyes. She was also watching the lobby, scanning, processing, the kind of person who doesn't stop thinking just because the situation has gotten out of hand. Her eyes found Caleb. I was standing against the wall, partially behind a marble column, where the security team hadn't noticed him yet. He met her gaze directly and didn't look away. And then she did something that stopped everything for a second. She raised both hands to the center of her chest, slowly, so the man with the knife wouldn't see, and signed, "Help." He has a knife, clean, accurate ASL. Not perfect. Her hand shape on knife was slightly off, but clear enough. She knew it. She was using it deliberately. Caleb felt something old and specific unlock somewhere in his chest. He kept his face neutral. He held eye contact. And then, slowly enough that no one else would register the movement, he signed back, "I see you. Stay still. Look at me." She blinked once. Then her face did something subtle, a fraction of tension leaving the set of her jaw, and she turned back to the man with the knife. Behind him, Holloway was still talking, louder now. "Sir, this building has full security coverage. There is no way out of this situation that involves you leaving with that knife. I need you to put it down right now and we can talk about whatever brought you here tonight." "Then stop talking at me like I'm an idiot," the man in the elevator shouted. His voice cracked on the last word in the way voices crack when a person has been holding something too tight for too long. "You keep saying talk and we can talk, but nobody in this building has ever actually—" "Sir, stop calling me sir." The younger woman in the corner made a small, involuntary sound. The man with the knife wheeled toward her. Caleb was already moving. Not toward the elevator. He had no intention of going to the elevator doors, where Holloway and his team were clustered, and where every movement would be visible and interpretable as threat. He moved sideways, along the wall, staying in the man's peripheral vision, but not in his direct line of sight. Holloway noticed him. "Mercer." His voice dropped but sharpened. "Back away. Let us handle this." Caleb didn't stop moving. "You're escalating him." "That's not your call. Get back." "He's going to use that knife if you keep shouting." Holloway stepped slightly toward him. The security officers behind him exchanged a look. "I said back away. You're maintenance. This is not your situation." Caleb looked at him. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. He just looked at Holloway with an expression that was very calm and very direct and said, "Lower your voice. Stop commanding. He needs someone to hear him, not arrest him." And then something unusual happened. Grant Holloway, who had been director of security at Meridian Tower for 6 years, and who had not been told what to do by a maintenance worker in the entirety of that period, stopped talking. Caleb didn't wait for further permission. He moved toward the service corridor door at the east end of the lobby. The service corridor was narrow and fluorescent lit, smelling of industrial cleaning solution and recycled air. Caleb moved down it quickly, counting doors until he reached the one marked ELEV Mechanical, authorized access only. He had the key on his ring. He always had the key on his ring because the facilities manager periodically had him run checks on the elevator systems when the contracted maintenance company was behind schedule, which was approximately always. He opened the panel and looked at what he was working with. The executive elevator had a different mechanical system than the regular bank, newer, with a more sophisticated load balancer and a secondary safety system that engaged automatically under certain fault conditions. What he was looking at now told him that the elevator hadn't failed. It had stopped. The secondary system had caught a signal irregularity, probably from the lobby-level sensor, and applied the magnetic brake as a precautionary measure. The elevator wasn't falling. It wasn't going to fall. But it was locked in place, and it would stay locked until someone with access to the mechanical controls manually released the brake and brought it down to ground level. The lobby control panel wouldn't do it. Holloway's keycard wouldn't do it. The system had transferred control entirely to the mechanical room, which meant it had transferred control entirely to wherever Caleb was standing. He put his hand on the manual release lever and did not move it yet. He needed a few more minutes. He needed the man in that elevator to come down from the worst of the panic before the doors opened, because the moment those doors opened, Holloway's people were going to move, and if the man still had the knife in a white-knuckle grip when that happened, someone was going to get hurt. He pulled out his phone. He still had a sightline, at an angle, through a small reinforced glass panel in the service corridor wall, to the elevator shaft. He could see her. The woman in the dark blazer. She was looking in his direction. She had positioned herself slightly between the man with the knife and the younger woman in the corner, which was either a protective instinct or a calculated move, and Caleb suspected it was both. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed down, then held up his palm. "Wait." She registered it. She turned back to the man. "What's your name?" she said. Her voice was steady, not soothing in the fake way, not the hostage negotiator's practiced calm that sounds like a script, just a person asking a real question. The man looked at her like she'd said something strange. "What?" "Your name. I'd like to know it." A long pause. "Marcus?" "Marcus." She nodded, not in a therapeutic way, just acknowledging. "My name is Victoria. I'm the CEO of this company, so if anyone in this building should be talking to you tonight, it's probably me." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. His grip on the knife was still tight, but his breathing had changed slightly. The sharp, overcrowded quality had loosened by a fraction. "You're the CEO," he said, flat, almost a laugh. "Unfortunately," Victoria said. Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not much, but something. "I had a meeting scheduled," he said. 3 weeks ago, your contracts department. They canceled it. Said the agreement wasn't—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. 7 years. "I had a 7-year supply contract with this company. They just voided it without—" His voice broke on the word and he pushed through it. "I have 40 employees, had 40 people who—" "I didn't know about the contract," Victoria said. And then, more carefully, "I'm not saying that to avoid responsibility. I'm saying it because it's true and because I want to understand what happened." Caleb, watching from the corridor, kept his hand on the lever and waited. "Keep him talking," he thought. "You're doing it right. Keep him talking." Marcus was saying something else now, about a meeting that never got rescheduled, about emails that went unanswered, about a certified letter he'd sent that had been— He believed, he said, his voice dropping into something exhausted and hollow, quietly filed and ignored, because small suppliers don't get the same treatment as large ones. And he wasn't large, he was just a man who had built something over 7 years and then watched it get canceled via a form email on a Thursday afternoon. Caleb had been listening. He had been listening to the whole thing, not just to the words but to the pattern underneath. The arc of a person who had started desperate, then frightened, then angry, and was now moving, slowly, into something closer to grief. Grief was different from panic. Grief you could work with. He adjusted his grip on the mechanical release and began very slowly, very carefully, to bring the elevator down. The movement was barely perceptible, a vibration, almost nothing, but he felt it travel through the mechanism, and he heard the faint, soft change in the ambient sound of the shaft. Victoria felt it too. She glanced in his direction for half a second. Marcus didn't notice. "I drove here tonight," Marcus said, his voice lower now, "because I didn't know where else to go. I wasn't planning—" He looked at the knife in his hand like he'd momentarily forgotten it was there. "I wasn't planning any of this. I needed someone to see what they did." "I see it," Victoria said. "You don't—" "I'm looking right at you, Marcus." Her voice didn't waver. "I see what it costs to stand here and say that out loud. I'm not going anywhere." Silence. The elevator had descended, almost imperceptibly, another 6 inches toward the ground. Caleb gave the lever one final, controlled movement. The elevator settled. He heard the floor alignment click into place. And then he signed, through the glass to Victoria, who was watching, a single word: now. Victoria looked at Marcus. "You've been heard," she said. "I promise you that. Whatever happens next, you came here and you said what happened to you, and I heard it. That matters." Marcus's hand loosened, not all at once, not dramatically. The way things actually come apart, gradually, incrementally, the way exhaustion finally wins over adrenaline when neither one leaves a person any other option. The knife dropped from his hand and hit the elevator floor with a sound that echoed up the shaft and out through the lobby. Holloway's team moved. Caleb stood in the service corridor for a moment after the doors opened. He heard shouting, controlled, professional, the sounds of people managing an arrested man. He heard the younger woman starting to cry, the kind of crying that happens when the body releases what it's been holding. He heard Victoria Sterling's voice, low and clear, directing her security team with a precision that suggested she hadn't been as frightened as her composure had hidden. He let out one slow breath. He put the mechanical lever back in its neutral position. He checked his watch. It was 12:41 in the morning. He had been in the service corridor for 37 minutes. His phone showed a text from Mrs. Okafor. "Eli asked when you'd be home. I told him soon. He's still up." Caleb put his phone back in his pocket. He unlocked the service corridor door and walked back out into the lobby, past the marble floors and the polished reception desk, and the security team still managing the situation near the elevator bank. Nobody stopped him. Nobody looked at him. He picked up his mop from where he'd left it against the wall, walked to the supply closet at the end of the east corridor, and stood there in the dark for a moment with his hand against the cool metal shelving. Eli is still up, he thought. He thought about his son sitting in the living room of their apartment with Mrs. Okafor, probably with the TV on and the captions running, probably with one of his picture books open on the cushion beside him, waiting for the sound of the door. Caleb reached up and pressed the back of his hand briefly against his eyes. Then he dropped his hand, straightened up, and walked back out to finish the rest of his shift. He finished the shift at 6:15 in the morning. The lobby floors had been cleaned, the service corridor had been swept, the mechanical room log had been updated with a note about the executive elevator's secondary brake system engaging due to sensor fault. He wrote it in the same flat, factual language he used for every maintenance report, giving no indication that he had been the one to manually release the brake while a man with a knife stood 12 feet above the lobby floor. That wasn't his department. He was maintenance. He wrote down what was wrong with the equipment and what he had done to address it, and he left the rest of the night's events to whoever was responsible for writing up the rest. He drove home through the early morning city when the streets were thin with traffic, and the light was that particular gray-blue that only exists for about 40 minutes before the sun actually commits to rising. He parked in the lot behind his building, sat in the car for about 90 seconds doing nothing, and then went upstairs. Mrs. Okafor had fallen asleep in the armchair with a crossword puzzle book open on her lap. Eli was in his bed, but not asleep. Caleb could tell by the way his son's shoulders tensed slightly when he heard the door, and then very deliberately relaxed, the way kids do when they're pretending they weren't waiting. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand on Eli's back, and Eli turned over and signed, sleepy and loose. "You're late." "I know," Caleb signed back. "Go to sleep. Are you okay?" Caleb looked at his son for a moment. 7 years old, with one eye still half closed with sleep and his hair pushed sideways against the pillow, waiting for an honest answer in the way children wait when they've already decided they're owed one. "Yeah," Caleb signed. "I'm okay." Eli studied him for another 2 seconds, the way he sometimes did, holding his father's face in his gaze with a seriousness that had no business being on a 7-year-old, and then turned back over, pulled the blanket up, and was asleep again inside of 3 minutes. Caleb stayed sitting on the edge of the bed for a while longer. He wasn't thinking about the elevator. He wasn't thinking about Grant Holloway, or Marcus, or the knife, or the particular sound it had made hitting the elevator floor. He was thinking, for some reason, about a morning 2 years ago when Eli had caught a cold in November, and Caleb had called in sick to stay home with him, and they had spent the entire day on the couch watching nature documentaries with the captions on eating soup. Caleb had made from scratch, because the canned stuff had too much sodium, and Eli's pediatrician had mentioned, once casually, that high sodium wasn't great for kids. He remembered that day with a clarity that made no sense given how ordinary it had been. Just the couch and the soup and the blue light of the television and Eli falling asleep against his arm sometime around 4 in the afternoon. That was the thing he had been protecting in that service corridor. That specific, ordinary, irreplaceable thing. He got up, went to his bedroom, and slept for 4 hours. I was back at work the following evening, and the one after that, and the one after that. Nobody from upper management contacted him. No HR representative left a message. The incident report filed by Grant Holloway's department, which Caleb learned about secondhand through one of the overnight security officers named Deshaun, mentioned a cooperative response from facilities staff in one subordinate clause, which was the corporate equivalent of not mentioning him at all. That was fine. That was in fact exactly what Caleb had expected. He had not expected Victoria Sterling to appear in the service corridor on the 4th night. He was replacing a faulty ballast in one of the fluorescent fixtures near the maintenance bay. When he heard footsteps coming from the direction of the lobby entrance, not the heavy, purposeful stride of security doing rounds, but something more careful, like someone navigating a space they weren't familiar with and didn't want to announce themselves in. He turned around. She was wearing jeans and a dark gray jacket over a white shirt, no blazer, which told him she hadn't come from a meeting. Her hair was down. She looked different out of the context of the elevator, smaller somehow, or maybe just less armored, but her eyes were the same as they'd been through the glass. Alert, processing. She stopped when she saw him. "I wasn't sure this was the right corridor," she said. "It's the only one that goes to the mechanical bay," Caleb said. "What can I do for you, Ms. Sterling?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to categorize. Not the warm and practiced expression of an executive performing gratitude. Something more unresolved than that. "I wanted to find you before someone else set up a formal meeting about it," she said. Those tend to turn into things where the actual conversation doesn't happen. Caleb set down the ballast he'd been holding. Okay. You knew sign language. Yes. And you knew how to work the elevator's mechanical system. It's part of my job. The contracted maintenance company runs behind, so facilities— I'm not asking you to justify knowing it, she said. I'm saying you used both of those things in about a 30-second window and made a decision that my entire security team wasn't capable of making. I want to understand who I'm talking to. Caleb looked at her steadily. You're talking to the person who cleans this corridor. I'm talking to the person who kept that man from using his knife, Victoria said. There was no warmth in it, no softening. She said it the way you state a fact that you've already verified. Holloway's incident report doesn't mention your name. I noticed that. Does that bother you? He thought about it for a second, actually thought about it, which she seemed to register. She didn't move or prompt him. No, he said. Not really. She studied him. Why not? Because I wasn't looking for it to go in the report. A pause. What were you looking for? He picked the ballast back up, turned it over in his hands once. To get home by 7. I've got a kid. Victoria Sterling was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Can I ask you something? You've been asking me things. She almost smiled. Not quite. The sign language. You knew I was using ASL. You knew it well enough to respond in it, in the dark, under pressure, without hesitating. That's not something you pick up casually. My son is deaf, Caleb said. I learned when he was an infant. Something changed in her expression. Not pity. He'd gotten good at detecting pity, and this wasn't it. More like a recalibration. Like a variable she hadn't accounted for had just been added to an equation she was running. And the rest of it, she said? The way you read him, Marcus. You knew he was going to escalate before Holloway did. You knew what Holloway was doing wrong. You positioned yourself, you communicated through glass with no sound. You controlled the mechanical system while simultaneously— Ms. Sterling. She stopped. I'm not going to talk about the rest of it, Caleb said. It's not relevant to the job I do here. This corridor was quiet for a moment. Somewhere above them, the building's HVAC system cycled through a phase change with a low, resonant hum. Okay, Victoria said finally. Okay? I said okay. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a card. A business card, plain white, with her direct number handwritten on the back. She set it on the shelf beside him rather than handing it to him directly, which was a small thing but a specific one. If you want to talk, call that number. Not the main line, that one. She turned and walked back toward the lobby entrance. Caleb looked at the card for a moment. Then he put it in his shirt pocket and went back to the ballast fixture. I didn't call. Not that night, not the following week. He went to work and came home and took Eli to his Saturday morning language session at the rec center and made dinner and helped with homework and did all the ordinary constituent parts of his ordinary constructed life. But something had shifted, and he couldn't quite put it back. It wasn't the elevator incident. He had been in situations more dangerous than that. He had been in situations that made that elevator look like a slow Tuesday, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat in him in the heavy, specific way that certain kinds of experience sit in people who have had them. What had shifted was something else. Something about the way it had felt to use those instincts again. Not the adrenaline. He didn't miss the adrenaline. He had made his peace with not missing it. But the particular quality of focus. The way the world narrowed and clarified when there was a real problem with a real solution, and his entire attention was required to find it. He had spent 3 years narrowing his world down to Eli and this building and the predictable parameters of maintenance work. He had done it deliberately. He had needed to. But he was 37 years old, and his hands were steady, and his mind still ran certain calculations without being asked to, and standing in the service corridor with a malfunctioning ballast on a Thursday night, he felt the particular loneliness of a specific kind of competence that no one around you can see. He didn't call Victoria Sterling, but he did, about 10 days later, send an email to the facilities manager, a man named Paul Ehrlich, who wore the same 3 shirts in rotation and responded to maintenance requests with the energy of someone being asked to donate a kidney, flagging 3 separate issues he had identified during his rounds. The first was the recurring fault in the executive elevator's lobby-level sensor, which had caused the brake engagement on the night of the incident and which had still not been addressed. The The second was a pressure anomaly he'd noticed in the fire suppression system on the 14th floor. The third was a gap in the emergency lighting coverage in the northwest stairwell, which meant that in a power failure, anyone using that stairwell between floors 9 and 11 would be navigating a stretch of absolute darkness for approximately 40 feet. He attached photographs. He documented the timestamps of his previous reports on the elevator sensor, the 2 written reports, the verbal report, all of which had been received and not acted upon. He sent the email at 11:58 at night and went back to mopping the lobby floor. Paul Ehrlich forwarded it to his supervisor without reading it carefully. His supervisor forwarded it to someone in risk management. Risk management forwarded it to legal. Caleb found this out 2 weeks later, when a woman from legal named Sandra Chen appeared at the maintenance bay with a printout of his email and a very carefully neutral expression and asked him if he'd be willing to walk her through his concerns. He walked her through them. She took careful notes. She asked him, at the end of the walkthrough, whether he had documented his previous reports. He had. He pulled up the digital maintenance log on his phone, which he kept copies of in his personal records going back to his first week on the job, and showed her the timestamps, the ticket numbers, and in 2 cases the follow-up notes he had added when no action was taken. Sandra Chen looked at his phone for a long time. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "do you understand the liability exposure this documentation represents?" "I understand that the sensor fault wasn't fixed," Caleb said, "and that a man ended up trapped in an elevator because of it, and that could have gone worse." That's, she paused, "that's one way to characterize it. It's an accurate way." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to need copies of everything you just showed me." He forwarded her the files before she finished the sentence. What happened next was the kind of thing that happens inside large organizations when someone with actual documentation surfaces a problem that other people have been hoping would stay submerged. A great deal of urgent, anxious activity conducted almost entirely out of sight of the person who had surfaced the problem. Caleb heard about some of it through Deshawn, who worked the overnight security desk and had a talent for absorbing institutional information, the way certain surfaces absorb sound, completely and without appearing to do anything in particular. Deshawn told him that there had been a meeting, then another meeting, then a meeting about the meetings, that Paul Ehrlich had been spoken to about response protocols, that risk management had flagged several additional items in the building's deferred maintenance queue, that Victoria Sterling had asked specifically for Caleb's personnel file. Caleb received this last piece of information on a Tuesday, standing by the security desk eating a sandwich at 2 in the morning, and he chewed and swallowed and said, "Huh," and finished his sandwich. Deshawn looked at him. "That's all you've got? She asked for your file, man. The CEO." "I heard you." "And?" Caleb balled up the sandwich wrapper. "And nothing. I filled out the paperwork when I got hired like everyone else. There's nothing in the file that's going to tell her anything she can't already see." Deshawn shook his head slowly. "You are a strange person, Caleb." "So I've been told." Deshawn leaned back in his chair. He was 29, built wide through the shoulders, with a college degree in criminal justice and a practical understanding of workplace dynamics that far exceeded what the degree had taught him. He and Caleb had developed, over 3 years of shared overnight shifts, the particular kind of friendship that forms between people who see each other in the undressed hours of the night. Not close in the way that involves knowing each other's families or sharing significant personal history, but honest, which counted for a lot. "Can I ask you something?" Deshawn said. "You're going to anyway. What did you actually do that night, in the corridor?" He held up one hand before Caleb could answer. "I've seen the incident report. I know what it says. I'm asking what you actually did." Caleb looked at the wall behind the security desk for a moment. There was a monitor bank there showing feeds from 12 different cameras throughout the building. Camera 4 was the lobby. Camera 7 was the east elevator bank. He watched them both for a second. "I talked to her through the glass," he said. "Sign language. Told her to keep him talking and to stay calm. And I brought the elevator down manually from the mechanical room so that when she got him to drop the knife, the doors could open." Deshawn was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" "That's it." "And before that, the way you read this situation, the way you knew Holloway was making it worse." Caleb said nothing. Deshawn nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed rather than revealed. "Okay," he said. "I'm not going to ask." I appreciate that. I will say, Deshawn turned back to his monitors. Whatever's in that file, she's going to find out it doesn't explain you. And when she figures that out, she's going to come ask you directly again. Caleb picked up his trash. I know. And? He pushed away from the desk. And I'll figure it out when it happens. It happened on a Friday morning at 7:40, as Caleb was finishing his sign-out paperwork in the maintenance office on the basement level. He heard the door to the stairwell open, the basement level stairwell, not the elevator, and looked up. Victoria Sterling was wearing running clothes and carried a paper cup of coffee, which meant she had come from outside rather than from upstairs. She had walked here, to the basement, to the maintenance office. She sat down in the chair across from Caleb's desk without being invited. He waited. I read your personnel file, she said. Deshawn told me. She raised her eyebrows slightly. He tell you what's in it? I know what's in it. I filled it out. Victoria looked at him. Your employment history before Meridian Tower has a 4-year gap. Caleb put down his pen. Yes. And before that, you worked for a private logistics firm in Virginia for 14 months. That's what it says. And before that, your records are, she paused, sparse. He waited. I'm not going to dig through whatever it is you don't want found, she said. I want to be clear about that. This isn't an investigation. I'm not HR. Then why are you in my maintenance office at 7:40 in the morning? She looked at him with the same unresolved expression she'd had in the service corridor. Because I want to know what you need. That caught him off guard. He didn't show it, but she saw it anyway. The half-second pause before he answered was enough. I don't need anything from you, Ms. Sterling. That's not what I mean. She set her coffee down on the corner of the desk. I've spent the last 2 weeks looking at the security and facilities infrastructure of this building and realizing that it's... She stopped, started again. We had a man trap 3 people in an elevator with a folding knife, and the building's response was to send a former precinct cop with a loud voice and no plan. Our emergency systems failed. Our communication between security and maintenance was non-existent. The protocols we have on paper bear almost no resemblance to what actually works in practice. She paused. You knew all of that. You'd been documenting it for over a year. Nobody listened. Caleb was quiet. So what I want to know, Victoria said, is what you see when you walk through this building. Not what's in the maintenance log. What you actually see. The basement office was small and slightly damp and smelled of the same industrial cleaner as every other utility space in the building. The overhead light had a very faint buzz that Caleb had reported 6 months ago. Across from him sat one of the wealthiest people in the city, in running clothes, holding a coffee cup, asking him a question that nobody in this building had ever asked before. He sat back in his chair. You want the real answer, he said. I wouldn't ask otherwise. He looked at the wall for a moment. Not at anything in particular, just the direction he looked when he was organizing something in his head. The elevator sensor has been faulty since before I started working here. The fire suppression pressure on 14 is wrong and has been for at least 8 months. Your northwest stairwell has a lighting gap that would be dangerous in any real emergency. Your security team runs drills that are designed to look good in documentation, not to prepare people for actual crises. There's a culture gap between security and maintenance that means critical building knowledge lives in maintenance and critical decision-making authority lives in security, and those two groups never talk to each other. He paused. Your contractors are behind on service schedules by an average of 11 weeks because whoever manages the facility's budget approved the lowest bidder on the service contract, and the lowest bidder is behind on service schedules at every building in their portfolio. Victoria hadn't moved. And the reason that man got into an executive elevator with a knife, Caleb continued, is that your lobby access protocols for after-hours visitors have a gap in them. He didn't climb in through a window. Someone let him through the main entrance because the overnight process for verifying contractor badges has a step that gets skipped when the desk is understaffed, which it was that night because one of your security officers called in sick and Holloway didn't bring in coverage. Silence. I know, Victoria said. I found that last week. Did you find that Holloway knew before the incident that he was running understaffed and decided coverage wasn't necessary? A pause. I found that this week. Caleb nodded. She leaned forward slightly. How long have you known all of this? Most of it since about 3 months in, he said. The stairwell lighting I noticed about 8 months ago. The contractor schedule gap I started tracking last spring. And you reported it. The parts I could put in writing without being told it wasn't my department, yes. Her jaw tightened slightly. Not at him. Nobody acted on it. You're acting on it now. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the basement office door, somewhere in the service corridor, Caleb could hear the sound of the day shift janitor starting her rounds. The specific rhythm of a cart with a squeaky wheel that he'd been meaning to grease for a month. The building was waking up above them. Elevators moving, lights coming on in floors that had been dark since midnight. I want you at a meeting, Victoria said. Next Tuesday. I'm bringing in the security director, the facilities manager, the head of risk management, and the building operations lead. I want you to say exactly what you just said to me. Caleb looked at her. I'm maintenance. I'm aware. Those people are going to have a problem with me being in that room. I know. She picked up her coffee. Let me worry about that. He was quiet for a moment. He thought about Eli, which was where his mind went when he was making a decision that had some weight to it. He thought about what it would mean to step into a room like that. Not the risk of it. He had taken risks that made a conference room look like a parking lot, but what it would cost in other ways. The invisibility he had built was functional. It was useful. It kept certain questions from getting asked, certain records from getting pulled, certain people from looking at the gap in his employment history with more than passing curiosity. But he also thought about Deshawn and about the night security officer who had told him the building was short-staffed that night, and he'd replied that wasn't his department. And about the stairwell on 9 to 11 that he'd photographed and reported and photographed again, and nothing had happened. And about the feeling, which he couldn't entirely suppress, that he had spent 3 years watching a building full of people who didn't know they were at risk from problems that he could see and couldn't fix alone. I'll be there, he said. Victoria nodded. She stood up. She picked up her coffee and looked at him for a moment with that same unresolved look, like there was another question she was either not ready to ask or had decided to save. Your son, she said. How old is he? Caleb looked at her. 7. She nodded once, just barely, in the way people nod when a piece of information has landed somewhere it means something. Then she turned and walked out through the stairwell door, and her footsteps faded up toward the lobby. Caleb sat in the maintenance office for another minute. Then he picked up his sign-out sheet, completed it, put on his jacket, and went home to make Eli breakfast before school. The fluorescent light above him buzzed its faint, familiar buzz as he walked out, the same one he'd reported 6 months ago, the same one nobody had come to fix. He made a note to bring his own replacement bulb next Tuesday. The replacement bulb he'd brought from home sat in his jacket pocket on Tuesday morning, and Caleb put it in the fixture before the meeting started, standing on a step stool in the basement corridor at 7:15, while the building above him was still mostly quiet. It took 4 minutes. The buzzing stopped. He folded the step stool, put it back against the wall, and went upstairs to the 34th floor conference room where Victoria Sterling was about to make several people very uncomfortable. He took the elevator, which felt like a choice. The 34th floor was different from the basement in the way that the front of a stage is different from behind the curtains. Same building, different logic entirely. The carpet was thicker. The air smelled like something that cost money. The conference room had a glass wall facing the city and a table long enough to seat 20 people. And when Caleb walked in at 7:58, 8 people were already seated at it, and every one of them looked at him the way people look at something that has appeared where they didn't expect it. Grant Holloway was there. He sat at the left side of the table with his hands folded and his jaw set, in the particular way of a man who had been told something was going to happen that he didn't approve of and had decided to manage his disapproval through posture. Paul Ehrlich was 3 seats down, looking at his phone. Sandra Chen from Legal was at the far end with a yellow legal pad. 2 people Caleb didn't recognize. Risk management, he guessed, from the quality of their suits and the cautious way they held themselves. The building operations lead, a woman named Renata Voss, who Caleb knew slightly from quarterly walkthroughs, gave him a small nod that was either acknowledgement or apology. He wasn't sure which. Victoria was standing at the head of the table, not sitting, with a cup of coffee and a printed agenda she hadn't distributed yet. She looked at Caleb when he came in, and something in her expression settled. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "thank you for coming up." "Sure," he said. He took the open seat closest to the door, which was not at the far end of the table where it would have been easier to ignore him, but not at Victoria's immediate right either. A middle position. He set nothing on the table because he had brought nothing. He didn't have a laptop or a portfolio or a badge that said anything other than facilities, in letters too small to read from across the table. Holloway was looking at him with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. Victoria began. She talked for about 6 minutes without the agenda, which Caleb had the sense she had prepared the agenda mostly to make other people feel like the meeting had structure. What she actually did was describe, with a specificity that was clearly deliberate, every failure that had occurred in the building's security and facilities infrastructure over the preceding 18 months. Not in a general way. In a numbered, documented, time-stamped way that suggested she had spent the previous 2 weeks doing the kind of operational audit that people in her position typically delegated, and that she had, for reasons that were becoming clear, decided to run personally. She did not look at Caleb while she did this. She didn't need to. Every item she named was something he had documented. When she finished, the room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where several people are simultaneously calculating how much trouble they are in. Paul Ehrlich spoke first. Some of those maintenance tickets go through a triage system before. I'm aware of the triage system, Victoria said. I want to understand why items flagged as potential safety issues were sitting in the queue for 11 and 14 months respectively. Resource allocation, Paul. She said it quietly. We're not doing that today. I'm not here to assign blame. I'm here to understand what happened and figure out how to make sure it doesn't happen again. She turned to the room. But I can't do that without honest information, which means I need everyone in this room to be honest, including about what they didn't know and what they did know and chose not to act on. Silence. Holloway shifted in his chair. With respect, Victoria, I'm not sure why a member of the overnight maintenance staff is in this particular discussion. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Because he's the one who had the most accurate picture of this building's vulnerabilities and the least ability to do anything about them unilaterally. She paused. That's a systems failure, Grant. That's on the structure, not on him. But it means he's the person in this room with the most relevant direct knowledge. Holloway's jaw tightened. He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him without any particular expression. I'd like to hear from you, Victoria said to Caleb directly. Walk everyone through what you told me Friday morning. Caleb looked at the table for a moment. He wasn't nervous exactly. He had briefed people in rooms with considerably more at stake, in circumstances that made this conference room feel like a lunch break. But he was aware of how he was being perceived, and he was making calculations about how much of the truth was useful and how much would create resistance that would get in the way of the actual goal, which was fixing the building. He started with the elevator sensor, because it was the most documentable and the most directly connected to what had happened 3 weeks earlier. He described the fault in plain, specific terms. What the sensor regulated, what happens when it misreads, why the secondary brake system engaged, and what the mechanical room procedure was for releasing it. I explained that he had reported the issue twice in writing through the standard maintenance ticket system and once verbally to Paul Ehrlich, and he said this without any particular emphasis. The way you state a fact that has already been recorded. Ehrlich opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Caleb said. Not harshly, just clearly. Ehrlich closed his mouth. He went through the fire suppression pressure anomaly on 14, which he explained in terms of what it suggested about the condition of the suppression line in that section of the building, and what a failure would mean during an actual fire event. He talked about the stairwell lighting gap on 9 to 11, and walked through the math on what 40 feet of complete darkness does to evacuation time and injury rate when you have people moving in a panic. He talked about the security to maintenance communication gap, not as a complaint or an accusation, but as a structural problem. The building's critical operational knowledge was split between two departments that had no formal mechanism for sharing information, which meant that decisions were being made without the full picture and problems were being identified without the authority to fix them. He talked for 19 minutes. He didn't use notes. When he stopped, the room was different from how it had been when he started. Not warmer exactly, more awake. Sandra Chen had filled 4 pages of her legal pad. One of the risk management people, the one on the left, who had said nothing so far, let out a breath that wasn't quite a whistle. When you say the suppression line on There's pressure variance of about 12% from the baseline reading, Caleb said. It could be a gauge issue. It could be a line issue. Either way, it needs to be physically inspected by someone with the right certification, which our current service contractor hasn't done since the last scheduled check, which was 14 weeks ago and is in the service log. If that line fails during a fire event on 14, you have a suppression system that may not achieve adequate discharge pressure in the affected zone. He paused. That's a different problem from what happened 3 weeks ago, but it's the same category of problem. The risk management person looked at his colleague. Something moved between them that wasn't quite panic but was in the same neighborhood. Holloway was looking at the table. His hands were still folded, but the knuckles had gone slightly white. "Grant," Victoria said. He looked up. "The staffing gap on the night of the incident," she said. "Tell me about the decision." His jaw worked for a moment. "I made a judgment call. Officer Reyes called in sick and based on the building's occupancy profile at that hour. The access log shows 47 people in the building at the time of the incident," Victoria said, "including me. After hours, the profile is predominantly security staff and including me," she said again, not louder, just more precisely. A pause. "Yes. And the lobby screening protocol, the gap in contractor badge verification. Did you know about it?" This was the one Caleb had been waiting for. He watched Holloway's face. The security director was not a dishonest man, in Caleb's assessment. He was a man who had been running a department that was understaffed and under-equipped, and who had been making operational shortcuts for long enough that they no longer registered to him as shortcuts. He had built a mental model of the building's risk profile and then stopped questioning the model. That was a specific and common failure mode, and Caleb recognized it because he had watched it happen in contexts that made Meridian Tower look like a minor administrative concern. "I was aware the protocol had a weak point," Holloway said. "We'd flagged it internally." "When?" A pause. 8 months ago. "And?" "It was on the deferred action list pending a software integration with the new building access system." "Which has been pending for 14 months, Caleb said. Holloway looked at him sharply. "It's in the facilities log," Caleb said. "The access system integration was supposed to be completed in the first quarter of last year. It got moved to Q3, then to Q1 of this year. The contractor status notes say it's currently in progress, which is the same status it's had since it was first deferred." Holloway's expression moved through something complicated. "You've been tracking the access system integration timeline." "I've been tracking everything that affects building security," Caleb said. "It's relevant to my job." "Your maintenance." "I maintain the building," Caleb said. "The whole building, not just the floors." The conference room was quiet for a beat. Renata Voss was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing difficult arithmetic. Sandra Chen's pen hadn't stopped moving. Victoria set her coffee down. "I want to do a full walkthrough," she said. "This week. I want Caleb to lead it, with Grant and Renata, and I want a complete list of every unresolved safety-relevant item in this building with current status and timeline. Not the official timeline. The realistic one." She looked around the table, "We're not filing this in a queue. We're building an action plan with actual deadlines and actual accountability." Holloway said, "Victoria, Grant." Her voice was patient and entirely immovable. "I was in that elevator. I watched a man with a knife get talked down through a glass wall by a maintenance worker who had to control the elevator remotely because the standard protocols had already failed." She paused. "We got lucky. I'm not interested in being lucky again." Nobody argued with that. The walkthrough happened on Thursday. Caleb led it, which was surreal in a way he didn't examine too closely. He moved through the building with the same route he walked every night and the same deliberate, unhurried pace, while Grant Holloway and Renata Voss followed him and Sandra Chen's assistant trailed behind with a tablet, and he pointed out every problem he had documented and several he hadn't gotten to yet. He talked about load ratings and circuit capacity and sensor calibration intervals and the particular way water damage presents in a dropped ceiling versus a structural ceiling, and he talked about it in the flat, practical register of someone who had been paying attention to these things for 3 years, not because he was supposed to, but because he couldn't turn off the part of his brain that cataloged threats. Holloway was quiet for most of it. He asked a few questions, Specific ones, not defensive, and took some of his own notes on his phone. By the time they reached the northwest stairwell, and Caleb clicked on his flashlight to demonstrate exactly how dark the gap between 9 and 11 became. When the emergency lighting failed, Holloway had stopped standing slightly apart and was just standing next to him, looking at the same thing. "How long would it take someone to navigate that blind?" Holloway said. "Depends on the person," Caleb said. "Someone in good shape who stays calm, maybe 90 seconds. Someone in heels, or someone who panics, or someone with any mobility limitation. You're looking at 3-4 minutes minimum. In a fire evacuation with smoke, you could have people sitting down on those stairs because they can't see well enough to keep moving." Holloway looked up the dark shaft of the stairwell. "We've done fire drills in this building for 6 years. The drills run during business hours when the lighting is on," Caleb said. "Nobody's run a drill in this stairwell in the dark." A long pause. "We should have," Holloway said. It wasn't an apology. It was a man who had just genuinely absorbed something. Caleb recognized the difference. "Yeah," he said. They went back to the elevator bank. The executive elevator was running again. The sensor had been properly replaced the week before, finally, after the incident had made the priority level impossible to defer. Caleb ran through the mechanical room with Holloway, showing him the manual release and explaining the procedure he'd used. Holloway listened without the tight-jawed rigidity he'd carried in the conference room. "You've done this before," Holloway said, watching Caleb demonstrate the release sequence. "Controlled a stuck elevator manually." "I've done the procedure," Caleb said carefully. "As part of facilities work." Holloway looked at him for a moment. He was a man who had worked in security long enough to know what a careful answer sounded like. "You don't have to tell me," he said, "but I'm going to ask you something else, and I'd like a straight answer if you've got one." "Okay." "When you were in this corridor that night, with the man still in the elevator and the knife still in play, were you scared?" Caleb thought about it. "Some." "But you didn't stop." "No." "Why not?" He considered the question, not performing consideration, actually working through it, because nobody had asked him that directly, and he hadn't phrased it to himself in exactly that way before. "Because the thing I was scared of wasn't in the corridor," he said finally. "The thing I was scared of was letting it go wrong. Those are different fears. The second one's easier to work with." Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been doing this for 22 years, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone put it that way." They walked back out of the mechanical room. The service corridor stretched ahead of them, fluorescent lit and unremarkable. "For what it's worth," Holloway said, not quite looking at him, "the incident report should have named you." Caleb shrugged. "I'm not losing sleep over it." "I know. That's part of why I'm saying it." He glanced sideways at him. "It was wrong. I'm telling you it was wrong." Caleb looked at him. The man was uncomfortable in the way of someone who was not accustomed to this kind of conversation and was making himself have it anyway. "Okay," Caleb said. "Thank you." They left it there, which was the right place to leave it. The full inventory took another 3 days to compile. Caleb put it together himself, working with Renata Voss's operations data and Sandra Chen's records and his own personal maintenance logs, which were considerably more detailed than anything in the official system. When he handed the final document to Victoria, 112 items, categorized by severity and estimated remediation time, with a recommended priority sequence. She read the first 3 pages in silence, and then set it down and looked at him. "This is thorough," she said. "I had time to compile it." 3 years of time, she said. He didn't argue with that. She looked back at the document. 47 items in the high priority category. 31 of those need to be resolved before winter, he said, the HVAC-related ones especially. If you run the building through a cold season with the duct routing on 17 and 23 in current condition, you're going to have air quality issues that the occupants will notice. And the other 16? Those have wider timelines, but they're still critical. If you want, I can walk you through the priority logic. She turned to the section he meant and studied it. She asked 4 questions. He answered them without any throat clearing or hedging because the answers were things he knew. She asked a 5th question about the elevator contractor's service history that he hadn't expected, and he said he'd need to pull the records to give her an accurate answer, which was the truth. And she nodded. It was a professional conversation, not a warm one, not an uncomfortable one. Just two people looking at a real problem and talking about it in real terms. But when it was done, and Caleb reached for the document to point out one additional note he'd added on page 9, Victoria said without looking up, "How long have you been doing this?" He stilled. "The job?" "Any of it." She looked at him. The documentation, the pattern recognition, walking into a room and immediately identifying everything that could go wrong in it. He sat back. He knew what she was asking. He had been waiting for some version of this question since the basement office Friday, since the service corridor the week before that. The question had been sitting in every conversation they'd had, politely not asked, and now here it was. "A long time," he said. "That's not an answer." "I know." Victoria folded her hands on top of the document. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Marcus in the elevator, not performing empathy, just paying actual attention. "You told me you wouldn't talk about the rest of it. I'm not trying to pull your history out of you, but I want to be honest with you, so I'm going to tell you what I already know." He waited. "I have a friend who works in federal contracting," she said. I asked her, informally, what the employment records of someone with a certain kind of background might look like. She described a gap of 3 to 5 years, preceded by positions that are technically accurate but functionally opaque, followed by a deliberate step into a completely different kind of work. She paused. She also told me the sign language thing is not uncommon, that people who spend time in certain specialized environments develop language skills because they're useful. Caleb was looking at the far wall. "I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything," Victoria said. "I just want you to know that I'm not asking my questions out of ignorance." He turned back to her. "Then why are you asking them?" "Because I want to understand what you're doing here," she said. "In this building, in this job. I want to understand what you need, and I want to understand—" She paused again, and this time the pause was different, like she was being careful about the weight of the next part. "Whether you're actually where you want to be." He looked at her for a long moment. She was 30 years old and ran a $9 billion company, and she was sitting across from him in a conference room on the 34th floor, asking whether he was where he wanted to be. And the question was both presumptuous and entirely fair, which was a combination he hadn't encountered many times. "I'm where I chose to be," he said. "That's not the same thing." "I know," he said, "but it's honest." She held his gaze. "Your son." "Yes." "You left, whatever the other thing was, for him." "I left it because I needed to," Caleb said. "He was part of that. He was most of that." He looked at the document on the table between them, all 112 items, the 3 years of quiet accumulation. "I'm not unhappy here. I want to be clear about that. I like knowing how the building works. I like fixing things. It's not— I didn't step down into something lesser. It's just different." "But you're working nights cleaning floors," Victoria said, "and you have the knowledge and capability to be running the operation." "I'm aware of the gap. Doesn't that bother you?" He thought about Eli at the Saturday language session, working through a new hand shape with his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, the way he did when he was focused. I thought about the apartment on Tuesday nights when they did homework together at the kitchen table, Eli's assignments and Caleb's maintenance reports, both of them working in their own quiet alongside each other. He thought about what it would mean to take on a different role, more visibility, more hours, more of the building's energy coming toward him instead of passing him by. "Sometimes," he said, "when I'm honest about it, yes." Victoria nodded. She looked back at the document. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to leave that where it is for now." She tapped the first page. "This is what we need to work on. Can you be available to meet with the operations team twice a week while we build the action plan? During the day or in the evening? Whichever works for your schedule." He thought about Mrs. Okafor, who did Tuesdays and Thursdays. He thought about the Saturday language session and the pediatric hearing appointment in 3 weeks, and the school pickup that he'd arranged through a neighbor on the days it overlapped with his sleep schedule. All the logistics of a life built carefully around a single non-negotiable commitment. "Late afternoons work," he said. 3:30, 4 o'clock. "Not Saturdays." "Not Saturdays," she agreed. She wrote it on the cover of the document. He stood to leave. He'd almost reached the door when she said his name, not Ms. Sterling's practice professional neutral, but the way she'd said it in the basement office, like she was actually addressing a person. He turned. "The man in the elevator," she said. "Marcus. I had my legal team look into his contract dispute. They found the cancellation was processed incorrectly. There was a clause in the original agreement that wasn't honored. We're in negotiations now to settle and restore the commercial relationship. She paused. I don't know if that matters to you. Caleb stood in the doorway. He thought about Marcus's hand on the knife. He thought about Marcus's voice cracking on the words 40 employees. He thought about the hollow, exhausted quality that had come into Marcus's face when Victoria had told him she was listening, the way a man's face changes when he has been waiting a very long time to be heard and has finally, at terrible cost to himself, been heard. It matters, Caleb said. She nodded. He went home through the early afternoon when the city was full in the way it's only full in the middle of weekdays, all the people who work the hours that are invisible to everyone else. The delivery drivers and the nurses finishing morning shifts, and the parents heading to school pickups, and the construction crews on the overpass 3 blocks from his building. He walked through it and thought about Marcus and about the stairwell on 9 to 11, and about the elevator sensor that had finally been replaced, and about the way certain things that have been wrong for a long time can be made right if someone with the authority to act eventually decides to pay attention. He picked Eli up from school at 2:45. His son came out of the building in a rush, backpack bouncing, and signed immediately without slowing down. We did fractions today, and Ms. Devereaux says I'm the fastest in the class. Fastest at fractions? Caleb signed back, falling into step beside him. Fastest at everything, Eli signed, with the complete uncomplicated confidence of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to understate. Caleb looked at his son walking beside him. The dark eyes and the slight frame and the backpack that was comically too large for his body, and felt the particular weight of the day settle and rearrange itself into something he could carry. Let's go home, he signed. Are we having pasta? Probably. I want the kind with the cheese on top. I know you do. They walked the 3 blocks to the apartment in the thin afternoon light, signing back and forth about fractions and pasta and whether the pigeons outside the building had gotten more aggressive since last week, which Eli maintained they had, and Caleb was not prepared to commit to an opinion on. It was an ordinary conversation, small and specific and entirely theirs. Above the city, Meridian Tower stood 72 stories against the sky, all that glass and steel and the 112 problems still waiting inside it, and the work that hadn't started yet, and the conversations that were still coming. But that was tomorrow. Today was pasta with cheese on top and a 7-year-old's strong opinions about pigeons, and Caleb Mercer was exactly where he needed to be. The action plan launched on a Monday, which was Caleb's idea. Mondays had a particular quality of institutional seriousness that Fridays didn't, and he had learned a long time ago that the timing of when you begin something shapes how people treat it. You start a difficult thing on a Monday and people understand it's real. You start it on a Friday afternoon and it becomes something to be revisited after the weekend, which means it becomes something that gets quietly set aside. So Monday it was. The first contractors arrived at 7 in the morning. Not the existing service company, whose contract Victoria had reviewed and declined to renew in its current form, but a different outfit, one that Caleb had researched at Victoria's request, and that had a service record he could actually verify. He had spent a Saturday afternoon on it while Eli was at his language session, cross-referencing contractor compliance reports through the building inspector's public database, which was not the most efficient way to spend a Saturday, but was more reliable than taking anyone's word for it. The new contractor's lead technician was a woman named Petra, who wore steel-toed boots and carried her own multimeter and asked Caleb, within the first 10 minutes of the site visit, exactly how long the suppression line on 14 had been running at reduced pressure. When he told her 8 months, she made a sound that was not quite a word and pulled up her tablet. That line needs to be physically traced end to end, she said. If there's a joint failure anywhere along the secondary run, the pressure differential won't show on the gauge until it's a real problem. I know, Caleb said. She looked at him sideways. You know a lot about fire suppression for a maintenance guy. I know a lot about the building. She seemed to decide that was sufficient. Okay, I need access to the ceiling cavity on 14 West. Who do I talk to? Me, Caleb said. Come on. They spent the morning on 14. Caleb had the ceiling access panel keys on his ring and knew which panels had clearance for a person to get their head and shoulders through without disturbing the HVAC runs. Petra traced the suppression line from the main riser junction to the end of the secondary run and they found the problem 62 feet into the trace, a compression coupling that had been installed slightly off-axis, probably during the last renovation cycle, that was weeping at about a third of its rated capacity. Not enough to cause a visible leak, the building had been dry above 14 for 3 years, but enough to explain the pressure variance and enough to fail completely under the thermal load of an active suppression event. Petra photographed it, measured it, and turned to Caleb. "This gets fixed today. This isn't a schedule it for next week situation." "I know," he said. "I'll get you the isolation shut-off access." It took 4 hours. When the line was repressurized and the gauge on 14 came up to within 2% of the baseline reading, Petra made a note in her tablet and looked at Caleb with an expression that was somewhere between professional respect and mild concern. "You said this was flagged 8 months ago." "I flagged it 8 months ago," he said. "It was in the deferred queue." 8 months? She shook her head, not elaborating, which didn't require elaboration. They moved to the stairwell. The lighting fix on 9 to 11 was more straightforward. A conduit run and 2 additional emergency fixtures in the gap zone, plus a recalibration of the photosensor that controlled the landing lights. Caleb had pulled the part numbers 2 weeks earlier, and they were already in the supply room. The electrician on Petra's crew completed the installation before 4 in the afternoon and ran the power fail test while Caleb stood in the stairwell between floors 9 and 11 and watched the emergency lighting come up the way it was supposed to. Clean and even, no dark stretch, no 40 feet of nothing. He stood in it for a moment, just stood there in the lit stairwell, and felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. The particular relief of a problem that has existed in your peripheral vision for long enough that you'd stopped fully registering it, finally being gone. He went back to work. The twice-weekly operations meetings became a fixed part of his schedule. He came in at 3:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which meant he was in the building for part of the afternoon before his overnight shift began, which meant he was putting in longer days than he was technically required to. He didn't think about it in those terms. He thought about it in terms of the 112 items and how many were left. By the end of the 3rd week, they were down to 79. The meetings were not always smooth. The operations team had their own rhythms and institutional habits, and a few of them had a quiet resistance to the process that expressed itself in logistical obstacles, scheduling conflicts, documentation delays, the particular passive friction of people who have been told to cooperate with something they didn't choose. Renata Voss was generally constructive. The risk management people moved fast once the liability implications became clear, which happened about 48 hours after Sandra Chen's legal team finished reviewing Caleb's full documentation. Paul Ehrlich remained difficult, not through any dramatic opposition, but through a steady low-grade obstruction that took the form of missing information and scheduling ambiguity and a habit of CCing people who didn't need to be CC'd on emails, which slowed everything down. Caleb handled Ehrlich the way he handled most things. He worked around him when possible and through him when necessary, and kept a complete parallel record of every decision and timeline, so that if Ehrlich's involvement created a gap, there was documentation of why. He didn't complain about it. He mentioned it once to Victoria, briefly, in a meeting that had run long on a Thursday. "Paul's a problem," he said. "I know," she said. "He's not going to get better." "I know that too." "What are you going to do?" She looked at him. "What I need to, when the time is right." She turned back to the agenda. "What's the update on the access control integration?" He gave her the update. The contractor who had been managing the access system integration for 14 months had been formally notified that the contract was under review, which had produced, with remarkable speed, a revised completion timeline of 6 weeks. Caleb had said 6 weeks was acceptable if they hit the first milestone on schedule. The first milestone was in 10 days. "And if they miss it?" Victoria asked. "Then we find someone who won't." She made a note. The meeting continued, the thing Caleb hadn't expected, the thing that had not been in his calculations when he'd agreed to come to the Tuesday meeting 6 weeks earlier, was how much of the work turned out to be about people rather than systems. The physical infrastructure problems were real and fixable and had clear solutions that could be implemented by people with the right tools and the right access. But the larger problem, the one that had allowed the physical problems to accumulate unaddressed for months and years, was a culture problem. And culture problems don't get fixed by replacing a coupling in a suppression line. He was thinking about this on a Thursday afternoon when Grant Holloway appeared at the door of the conference room 12 minutes before the scheduled meeting and said, "Can I talk to you for a minute before everyone gets here?" Caleb looked at him. "Sure." Holloway came in and closed the door behind him. I was a man who took up space in a room in a way that was hard to ignore. The size of him, the former police bearing, and he was clearly uncomfortable, which on him looked like a kind of controlled rigidity, like someone holding something carefully so it didn't spill. He sat down across the table. "I owe you a real conversation." Caleb waited. "The night of the incident," Holloway said, "I was wrong about how I handled it. Not just the staffing decision, the whole approach. The shouting, the commands, treating the guy in the elevator like a tactical problem to be contained instead of—" He stopped. "And I was wrong about you. The way I spoke to you in the lobby. You were right, and I was wrong, and my priority should have been the people in that elevator, not my authority." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "Okay. That's all you've got? What do you want me to say, Grant?" Holloway's jaw worked slightly. "I don't know. Something." "You did the best you knew how to do that night," Caleb said. "The problem isn't that you're a bad security director. The problem is that nobody gave you the tools or the training or the information to do better. That's what we're trying to fix." He paused. "The apology is appreciated, I mean that, but the fix is more useful than the apology." Holloway looked at him for a long moment. "You're a strange person to work with, you know that?" "Deshaun says the same thing." Something shifted in Holloway's face, and for a moment, just a moment, he almost laughed. "Yeah, Deshaun's smart." He sat back. "I want to redesign the crisis response training, not the documentation, the actual training. Real scenarios, realistic conditions, including the lighting and communication gaps and the coordination with facilities." He looked at Caleb directly. "I want you involved in designing it." Caleb considered this. It was different from the infrastructure work. Infrastructure work had a clear deliverable. The thing was broken, you fixed it, it worked. Training was messier, more dependent on how people responded in the moment, harder to measure. But it was also the part of the problem that the physical fixes couldn't touch. "What's your timeline?" Caleb said. "I want the first session running before winter." "That gives us about 11 weeks. Is that enough?" "If we start now, it might be." He looked at the table. "I have some ideas about scenario design, but I want Deshaun involved. He's the one who actually works the overnight conditions we're training for." Holloway nodded. "Done." The door opened and Renata Voss came in with two members of the operations team, and the meeting started, and the conversation with Holloway folded itself into the broader work, which was right, which was how it should be. Not a dramatic turning point, just two people who had started on the wrong foot, figuring out how to work. Eli had a bad week in the 5th week of all this. Not sick, his health was fine, but something at school had gone sideways. Caleb pieced it together over the course of several evenings, which was the way he usually got information from Eli, not in a single conversation but in installments, because Eli processed things slowly and in his own sequence and tended to release information when he was ready and not before. What had happened was that a kid in his class had made fun of the way Eli signed, specifically had mimicked it, the way children sometimes do, the quick crude imitation, fingers wiggling in mock ASL, the accompanying laughter. Eli hadn't told the teacher. He'd come home that day and been quiet in the particular way that meant something had happened, but he wasn't saying what. And Caleb had noticed and not pushed, and then the next evening Eli had sat down at the kitchen table and signed, very carefully, with the precise hand shapes of someone choosing their words. "A boy at school made fun of how I talk." Caleb had put down what he was doing. He had sat across from his son and looked at him for a moment. "What did you do?" he signed. "I didn't do anything. I didn't know what to do. That's okay. What did you feel?" Eli thought about it with the concentrated seriousness he brought to questions that mattered. "Mad," he signed. Then, "Also embarrassed," which made me more mad. "Yeah," Caleb signed. "That makes sense. Did that ever happen to you?" Caleb looked at his son. He thought about how to answer that honestly without either minimizing it or making it bigger than it needed to be in this moment. "Not the same way," he signed. "But people have underestimated me, made me feel like I didn't belong in a room." "What did you do?" "I kept being in the room," Caleb signed, "and I kept being good at what I did until the room caught up." Eli thought about this for a while. Outside, a car went past with its window down and music coming out of it, the bass registering as vibration against the apartment walls. Eli could feel bass. He sometimes put his hand on the kitchen table to feel the vibration of things. Is that what I should do? He signed. I think so, Caleb said. But you can also tell the teacher. You don't have to handle it alone. Did you ever tell anyone? Caleb held his son's gaze. Sometimes, he signed. Not always when I should have. Eli nodded slowly, with the gravity of someone receiving information that they intend to file away and consult later. Okay, he signed. Then, can we have cereal for dinner? I don't want real food tonight. Yeah, Caleb signed. We can have cereal. They had cereal and watched a nature documentary about deep-sea fish, which Eli found horrifying and fascinating in equal measure, and which he narrated extensively and signed throughout, describing each species with a creative interpretation that had only a passing relationship with the documentary's actual captions. Caleb watched his son's hands moving in the blue television light and felt the specific, unquantifiable weight of loving someone small and capable and still so new to the world's harder edges. He called the school the next morning. He spoke to Eli's teacher, who was apologetic and specific and promised to address it, which she did. Eli reported back, a few days later, that it had been handled, with the slightly anticlimactic tone of someone who had been building up to something and found the resolution faster than expected. The boy said sorry. He signed. It wasn't a very good sorry, but it was a sorry. Sometimes that's what you get, Caleb signed. Is that enough? He thought about Holloway in the conference room, 12 minutes before a meeting, saying something real that he'd been carrying. It depends on what the person does after, he signed. The sorry is the start. The rest of it is what they do next. Eli considered this. That's complicated. Yeah, Caleb signed. It is. It was in the 7th week that Paul Ehrlich made his move, which was not dramatic in the way of someone staging a confrontation, but was instead the particular kind of administrative backstab that certain people in certain organizations execute with the practiced ease of long experience. What Ehrlich did was this. He submitted a formal facilities restructuring proposal to the Building Operations Committee, a document that had been prepared from the evidence of its completeness over the preceding several weeks, which recommended consolidating the maintenance department under a new management structure, absorbing the external contractor coordination role that had informally developed around Caleb's involvement in the action plan, and recategorizing the overnight maintenance staffing to reflect what Ehrlich's proposal called actual operational requirements, which, translated, meant reducing the overnight crew from 3 to 2, eliminating the position that Caleb had held for 3 years, and creating a new daytime position with different responsibilities that Caleb's seniority and current classification would not qualify him for. It was thorough. It was documented. It was, on the surface, a legitimate operational proposal. Caleb found out about it on a Tuesday morning from Renata Voss, who called him, not emailed, called, at 8:15 while he was asleep after his shift. He was awake by the second ring. Paul submitted a restructuring proposal, Renata said. She had the tone of someone delivering information they considered their professional obligation to deliver. It goes to the Operations Committee Thursday. If it passes, your current position is eliminated effective end of next month. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed in the thin morning light coming through the blinds. His apartment was quiet. Eli had left for school 40 minutes ago. When did he put it together? Based on the formatting and the data sources, I'd say at least 4 weeks, maybe more. 4 weeks ago, Caleb had been in the 3rd week of the action plan. The timeline of the thing sat in his mind for a moment, arranging itself into a shape he recognized. Ehrlich had started building the exit before the process had been going long enough to produce results that would be hard to undo. Smart, in a specific and unpleasant way. Is Victoria aware? Caleb said. It was submitted through the standard committee process. It doesn't require her sign-off before it goes to the committee. That's not what I asked. A pause. I don't know. I found out an hour ago. Okay, Caleb said. Thank you for telling me. He hung up and sat with it for a minute. There was a thing that happened when a threat materialized. A specific internal shift, something that had once been trained and had since become just part of how he processed information, where the emotional response and the practical response separated out cleanly. The emotional response was allowed to exist in its own space, while the practical response ran its assessment. It usually took about 90 seconds. He pulled up his phone and started reviewing what he had. 3 years of personal maintenance logs, time-stamped and backed up. Complete documentation of the action plan process, including every meeting, every decision, every item from the 112. His original email to Ehrlich from 6 weeks before, with the attachments. The previous reports on the elevator sensor, the suppression line, the stairwell, the incident report from the night of the elevator, which didn't mention his name but which he had cross-referenced to the mechanical room log that he had personally authored. And this was the piece that mattered, the formal record of the action plan itself, which had been established under Victoria Sterling's authority, with Caleb designated as the facility's technical lead, a designation that appeared in the meeting minutes from the first Tuesday session and every one after. He got dressed. He called Renata back. "Can you send me the committee's standard operating procedures for proposal review?" he said. "Specifically the section on personnel impacts of operational restructuring." A brief pause. "I'll send it in 10 minutes. He read the procedures while he drank his coffee. There was a provision, not buried, it was in the third section, requiring that any restructuring proposal that affected positions directly involved in active operational initiatives receive review by the initiative lead before committee consideration. It was not a veto right, but it was a procedural step that had not been followed, because Ehrlich had not included Caleb in the committee submission. He read it twice to make sure he had it right. Then he called Victoria Sterling's direct number. She picked up on the second ring. "I was going to call you," she said. "You know, Sandra sent it to me 40 minutes ago. I've been reading it." A pause. "It's thorough." "I noticed that." "He's been working on it for a while." "At least 4 weeks," Caleb said. "Renata thinks longer." Silence on the line. "I want to be careful about how I handle this," Victoria said. "I can pull it from the committee agenda, but if I do it in a way that looks like I'm protecting you specifically, it creates a different problem." "There's a procedural issue," Caleb said. "Committee procedures require initiative lead review for restructuring proposals affecting active initiative roles. He didn't include me." Another pause. Longer. "Where's that?" "Third section. The provision on personnel impacts." He heard the sound of typing. Then, "I'm reading it." He waited. "You're right," she said. "That's a legitimate procedural deficiency. The proposal gets returned for proper process." Another pause. "Caleb." "Yeah." "Did you know about this provision before today?" He was honest. "No, I read the procedures this morning." She made a sound that might have been something close to a laugh, except it was too dry for that. "Okay." She paused again. "I also want to address the substantive proposal. Even procedurally returned, he can resubmit it correctly. I need to be ready for that." "The substantive proposal has problems," Caleb said. "The overnight staffing reduction he's proposing doesn't account for the expanded maintenance requirements from the action plan. We've added responsibilities and upgraded systems. You can't reduce the crew at the same time. I can document that." "I know," she said. "I figured that out about 8 pages in." "Then you've already got what you need." "Yes," she said. "But I want you to document it formally, for the record." He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the cost-benefit of being a person who is documentably useful in a situation where someone is trying to remove you, versus being a person who simply trusts that the work speaks for itself. He had learned in various contexts that the work rarely speaks loudly enough on its own. "I'll have it ready by Wednesday afternoon," he said. "Thank you." Then quieter. "I'm sorry you're dealing with this." "It's manageable," he said. "That's not the same as not being a problem." He thought of Eli at the kitchen table. "Is that enough?" And his own answer, "It depends on what the person does next." "No," he said, "it's not." He spent Wednesday constructing the counter-documentation with the same methodical attention he'd given the original 112 list. He pulled the expanded maintenance responsibilities that had been added through the action plan. 12 new systems, 4 upgraded protocols, the external contractor coordination that had become a genuine ongoing function, and mapped them against the staffing hours required. He included the projected schedule for the remaining 31 high-priority items and showed that completing them on the established timeline was not feasible with a reduced overnight crew. He attached the letters from Petra's team confirming the ongoing service coordination requirements. He sent it to Victoria at 3:40 on Wednesday afternoon, 40 minutes before the Tuesday meeting, because he had a Tuesday meeting, and because the work was the work, regardless of what was happening in the committee process. Victoria received it, read it, and forwarded it to Sandra Chen with a note that said, "For committee record, full distribution." The committee meeting was Thursday. Paul Ehrlich's proposal was returned on procedural grounds at 10:17 in the morning, citing failure to complete required initiative lead review. Ehrlich was notified that a corrected submission would need to follow the standard procedure, including a formal review meeting with the initiative lead, before it could be reconsidered. Caleb was in the stairwell on 9-11 at 10:17, watching one of Petra's crew run a final calibration check on the new emergency fixtures, when his phone showed a text from Renata that said only, "Returned, procedural." He looked at the text for a moment. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and turned back to the calibration check. "Looks good," Petra's text said. "Within spec across all 3 fixtures." "Good," Caleb said. "Log it and send the compliance certificate to my email." "Will do." The stairwell was fully lit now from 9 to 11. All 40 feet of it, even, steady, the way emergency lighting is supposed to work. Caleb stood in it for a moment the way he'd stood in it the first time the new fixtures came on, and felt again that quiet, specific thing. Not satisfaction exactly, something more patient than that. The feeling of a problem being one step closer to fully solved. He went back to work. 2 weeks after the committee meeting, Paul Ehrlich submitted a voluntary resignation, citing a personal decision to pursue other opportunities. He gave 2 weeks' notice. At his small farewell gathering in the break room on the 33rd floor, attended by his direct reports and a scattering of people who felt obligated, Caleb was not present because he was asleep. He'd worked the overnight. Renata Voss was named interim head of facilities while a permanent hire was evaluated. In her first week in the role, she sent Caleb a text that said, "The contractor coordination function is being formalized. Wanted you to hear it from me first." Caleb read the text during his evening break, sitting in the maintenance office with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly too cold, in the same basement room where Victoria had found him in her running clothes 6 weeks ago, asking whether he was where he wanted to be. He looked around the room, at the damp walls and the faint smell of industrial cleaner and the overhead light that now worked correctly because he'd replaced the bulb himself the morning of the first meeting. At the maintenance log open on the desk, down from 112 items to 43. He thought about Eli at the kitchen table, signing that the boy's apology hadn't been very good, but it had been a sorry. Sometimes that's what you get. The sorry is the start. The rest of it is what they do next. He picked up his coffee, found it too cold, got up to pour a fresh cup, and sat back down to the log. 43 items. He got back to work. 43 items became 31, sometime in the middle of October, which Caleb noted in the log without ceremony because the work didn't require ceremony, it required accuracy. 31 became 19 by the first week of November, at which point the pace slowed not because the urgency had diminished, but because the remaining items were the complicated ones, the ones that required coordination across multiple contractors, or involved structural elements that needed engineering sign-off, or sat in the complicated bureaucratic territory between what the building owned and what the tenants were responsible for maintaining. These were the problems that had been deferred longest precisely because they were the hardest to solve, which was the nature of deferred problems. The easy ones get addressed eventually, and what's left over at the end is always the hardest residue of everything that nobody wanted to touch. Caleb worked through them the way he worked through everything, methodically, without drama. But the building was changing around him in ways that were harder to quantify than a numbered list. The security team and the maintenance crew had started talking to each other. Not in any organized or formal way at first. It was smaller than that. Deshaun had started leaving a note at the security desk on nights when he'd noticed something in the building that seemed off, maintenance adjacent, things that weren't his responsibility, but that he'd absorbed through proximity to Caleb's way of paying attention. A door that wasn't latching correctly on the service corridor. A smell near the east elevator bank that suggested something in the mechanical system was running warm. Small observations, accurately noted. Caleb had started leaving notes back. It was not a system. It was just 2 people who worked the same building at the same hours, deciding that information was more useful shared than kept. But other people noticed it and started doing their own version of it. And by November, the security desk had a shared log that maintenance staff could annotate, which Renata Voss had formalized with a one-page protocol that nobody had asked for, and that everyone used because it solved a problem they'd all been having without knowing they had a word for it. The crisis training program launched on a Wednesday in the second week of November, in the parking sublevel, which Holloway had chosen specifically because it was the ugliest and most realistic space in the building. Concrete walls, inconsistent lighting, the kind of environment that didn't let anyone pretend they were running a drill in comfortable conditions. Caleb had spent 3 weeks with Holloway and Deshawn designing the scenarios. They had built 4 of them: a medical emergency with elevator access failure, a fire evacuation with the lighting gap conditions replicated in the stairwell, an unauthorized access situation, and a combined scenario that Caleb had insisted on because real emergencies don't come in clean categories. 19 people went through the first session: security officers, maintenance staff, 2 people from the reception desk, 1 of the overnight cleaning crew who had volunteered. Holloway ran the facilitation. Caleb ran the technical elements, the controlled lighting failures, the elevator access simulation, the mechanical room procedures. Deshawn played, with considerable commitment and some natural talent, the role of an agitated building occupant in 3 of the 4 scenarios. It was not a smooth training. The medical scenario revealed that 2 of the security officers didn't know where the AED units were located, which was a genuine problem that got fixed the following morning. The fire evacuation exposed a coordination gap between the building's PA system operator and the stairwell direction assignments that had existed in the documentation, but not in anyone's actual understanding of what to do. The combined scenario was, by design, chaotic, and produced the particular kind of controlled panic that is the point of a well-designed drill. The moment when people discover what they actually do under pressure, as opposed to what they believe they would do. After the session, they sat in the parking sublevel on folding chairs, 19 people with coffee from the lobby machine, and Holloway ran the debrief. He asked what had worked and what hadn't, and people told him, including the things that reflected badly on themselves, which was a different quality of conversation than Caleb had seen from this group at the beginning of October. Caleb sat at the edge of the group and listened and said very little except when someone asked him a direct question. He had designed the scenarios to be answered by the people who ran them, not by him. One of the overnight security officers, a young woman named Tran, who had been working the building for 8 months, and who Caleb had noted was consistently the most situationally aware person on her shift, raised her hand during the debrief and said, "The thing I didn't know before today is that maintenance has access to building systems that security doesn't have, and that security needs in an emergency. I didn't know how to ask for it, or who to ask." "That's the gap," Holloway said. "That's the gap," Tran agreed. "How do we fix it?" She thought about it for a moment. "We need to know each other," she said, "not just who's on shift, what each person can actually do." Caleb looked at her across the circle. She was right. It was simple, and she was right. "We'll add a cross-familiarization component to the onboarding process," Holloway said. He looked at Caleb. "Didn't you put together a building systems overview for new security staff?" "I'll have it to you by end of the week," Caleb said. Tran nodded. She looked satisfied in the specific way of someone who has identified a real problem and watched it get accepted and committed to, which is rarer than it should be, and feels good when it happens. Caleb drove home that night thinking about what she'd said. We need to know each other, not the protocols, not the documentation, not the response plans, which were important and necessary and completely insufficient on their own. The people, their actual capabilities, what they knew how to do when everything else stopped working. That was the thing the building had been missing, not the sensor calibration or the suppression line or the lighting in the stairwell, though all of those had been real and needed fixing. The thing it had been missing was a way for the people inside it to actually know each other well enough to function together under pressure. And you couldn't build that into a protocol document. You built it through accumulated ordinary interaction, through notes left at a security desk, through a maintenance worker who happened to be standing in the lobby at midnight when someone needed to be seen. He wasn't sure there was a lesson in that so much as a fact, but it was a fact he understood now in a way he hadn't when he'd started this job 3 years and some months ago, when he'd been trying, consciously and deliberately, to be unseen. Victoria called him on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of November, which was unusual because she had a consistent habit of meeting in person when the conversation was substantive and only calling when something was time-sensitive. Are you free Monday? She said. I'm sleeping Monday morning. I'm in after 3:30. 4 o'clock, she said. My office, not the conference room. He was there at 4, which meant he took the elevator to the 61st floor for the first time since the night of the incident, because the 61st floor was where Victoria Sterling's actual office was, not the conference rooms where meetings happened, but the office she worked in, which turned out to be smaller than he'd expected and considerably more functional. A large desk covered in papers that were organized in a way that looked like chaos and probably wasn't. A standing monitor with 3 windows open, bookshelves that had actual books on them, not the decorative kind arranged by color, but the kind that had been read and returned to and in some cases had pages bent back. A window that faced north, which gave a view of the river, and beyond it, the low flat spread of the city's older neighborhoods. She was on the phone when he arrived. Her assistant showed him in and gestured at the chairs in front of the desk. He sat in the one on the left, which had a clear sight line to the door, and looked at the bookshelves while he waited. She finished the call, set down the phone, and looked at him. Thank you for coming up. Sure. She folded her hands on the desk. She had the expression she got when she was about to say something she'd prepared for. I want to offer you a position. He waited. Director of Facilities Resilience and Emergency Preparedness, she said. It's a new role. I've had Sandra in HR working on the description for the past 3 weeks. It encompasses the infrastructure work you've been leading through the action plan, the crisis training program with Grant, the contractor coordination, and ongoing building safety oversight. She paused. It's a full-time daytime position, with a salary that reflects actual market rate for what you've been doing, not what the maintenance classification pays. Caleb looked at her steadily. He had known something like this was coming. He wasn't oblivious, and the trajectory of the past 2 months had its own logic. But hearing it said directly was different from anticipating it, in the way that most things are different when they become real. What's the structure? He said. Who do I report to? Directly to me, she said. The role sits outside the standard facilities hierarchy. It has authority over emergency-relevant building systems and cross-departmental crisis coordination, which means you'd have a working relationship with Grant, with the operations team, with the contractors. Not reporting line authority over them, but functional authority when it comes to safety and emergency response. That's going to create friction. Some, she said. You're good at managing friction. I don't love managing friction, he said. I like fixing things. I know. This lets you do both. He looked at the window behind her. The river was silver in the November afternoon light. A barge was moving slowly against the current, its navigation lights just coming on in the early dark. What about the overnight shifts? He said. Who covers the building at night? The maintenance team is going to lose someone with the specific knowledge base. We hire for the position, she said. And you build the knowledge transfer into the onboarding. You've started doing that with the security cross-familiarization. Same principle. He thought about that. It was the right answer. He still noted that she'd had it ready. The schedule, he said. You said daytime. Standard business hours as the baseline. There will be evenings for training sessions, some weekend availability for contractor coordination on large jobs. But I know your situation. She paused. I know what the schedule means for your son. He looked at her. What does it mean? It means you'd be home at night, she said, consistently, instead of working midnight to 6. The thing about that statement was that it was entirely practical, and it also hit somewhere underneath practical, in the space where certain facts lived that are too significant to be processed quickly. He'd worked nights for 3 years. He'd arranged everything around nights. Mrs. Okafor on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the neighbor for school pickup, the compressed Saturday routines to make up for the days when he was sleeping while Eli was awake. He had built a functional life around those constraints so completely that he had largely stopped thinking about them as constraints. The idea of being home at night was disorienting in the specific way of a door that has been closed so long that you've stopped including it in your mental map of the room. I need to think about it, he said. Victoria nodded. Of course. Not because I'm not interested, he said, because I have to think through what the change means. I understand. He stood to leave. He'd almost reached the door, and he noted that this was becoming a pattern, him almost reaching the door and then something being said when she spoke. Caleb. He turned. She was still sitting at her desk, and she was looking at him with the same expression she'd had in the basement office in September. in the maintenance room with the buzzing light that he'd already fixed. The unresolved expression, the one that meant there was a question she'd been holding. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He waited. "Do you miss it?" she said. "Whatever it was. Before." It was a question nobody had ever asked him that directly, including people who knew exactly what the before was. He stood in the doorway of her office on the 61st floor and thought about it honestly, which meant not with the practiced deflection he used when the topic got too close, and not with the clean, comfortable answer he'd given himself for 3 years. Parts of it, he said. The focus. The sense that the work mattered in a way that was immediate and real. The feeling that I was using everything I had. He paused. Not the rest of it. What it cost. What it required me to be. She held his gaze. What did it require you to be? He looked at her for a moment. Someone who had to keep certain parts of himself very small, he said, so the other parts could function. She was quiet. Eli made that equation impossible, he said. You can't keep yourself small and also raise a kid. They see everything. He looked at the window again briefly. So I came home and I tried to figure out how to be a person again instead of just a function. He hadn't said that out loud before. Not in those words. The words were more precise than he'd expected them to be, which meant they'd been there for a while, waiting. Victoria looked at him. Do you think this job, the new one, do you think it fits that? It might, he said. That's what I have to think about. She nodded. He left. He thought about it for 4 days. He talked to Mrs. Okafor, who said, with the pragmatic warmth of a woman who had raised 4 children and had strong opinions about child development, that boy needs to see his father at dinner, that's what I'll say about it. He talked to Deshawn, who said, if you don't take it, I'll personally be annoyed with you for a long time. And then, more quietly, you've earned it, man. That's not nothing. He talked to no one else because there was no one else to talk to in the way that required honesty, which was a fact about his life that he noted and did not spend time being sorry about. He thought about Eli, not in the abstract way of parenting considerations, but specifically. Eli at the kitchen table with his fractions homework. Eli at the Saturday language session. Eli asking, are you tired, with one eyebrow up and one hand tilted sideways. Eli signing, are you okay? At 2 in the morning, when Caleb came home later than usual, all the small, accumulated evidence of a child paying close attention to a parent who was not always available to be paid attention to. He thought about what it would mean to be home, not just logistically, but in the lived daily texture of it. To be awake in the evenings when Eli was awake. To be the person who made dinner instead of the person who made dinner on Saturdays when he had the energy. To not have a child waiting up past his bedtime to hear the sound of the door. He thought about the elevator, and the service corridor, and the stairwell on 9 to 11, and the 112 items that were now down to 17. He thought about Tron in the parking sublevel saying, we need to know each other, and the way that had landed as the truest thing said in that room. He thought about Holloway in the conference room 12 minutes before a meeting, making himself say something real. He thought about Marcus, who he had heard about in passing from Deshawn, that the contract had been settled, that there were 40 people who still had jobs because of it, that Marcus had sent a letter to the building, addressed to no one specific, that had been received by security and passed around and eventually made its way to Caleb through 3 different people who each thought he should read it. The letter was handwritten, which was unusual enough that it stayed with him. It said, among other things, that Marcus understood what he had done that night, and that he was getting help, and that he wanted whoever had talked him down to know that they had given him a reason to come back from somewhere he wasn't sure he was coming back from. He didn't know who had done it. The letter was addressed to the building, which was the best he'd been able to do. Caleb had read it once and put it in the back of his maintenance log, where it had stayed. He called Victoria on Tuesday morning. I'll take it, he said. A pause. Okay. I have conditions. I assumed you would. The overnight maintenance position gets properly filled before I transition. I'm not leaving the night crew short-handed. I'll run the hiring process and the knowledge transfer myself. Agreed. The cross-departmental authority needs to be spelled out in writing. Not vague, specific. What I can act on unilaterally in an emergency and what needs sign-off. Sandra's already drafted language for that. I'll send it to you today. And I want to expand the crisis training program, not just Meridian Tower. I want to build a version we can run for the other properties in the portfolio. Silence for a moment. That's a bigger scope than we discussed. I know. But the problem we solved here exists in every building you own, and we now have the model to address it. Another pause. Longer. He could hear her thinking. Let me look at the portfolio operations budget, she said. Give me 2 weeks. That's fine. Anything else? He thought for a moment. The formal title, can we adjust it? To what? Drop director, he said. I'd rather it say head of. It's less… He looked for the word. Architectural. She was quiet for a second. Then, very briefly, she made the sound he had heard once before, the one that was too dry to be a laugh but was in the same neighborhood. Head of Facilities Resilience and Emergency Preparedness, she said. Done. The hiring process for the overnight position took 3 weeks. Caleb ran it himself, with Renata's administrative support, and interviewed 6 candidates. He hired a man named Ortega, who was 44 years old and had spent 12 years in building operations for a hospital system, which meant he had a specific and practical understanding of both physical infrastructure and the particular human stakes of buildings where things going wrong had consequences. He was methodical and asked good questions, and had the quality Caleb valued most in anyone who would be working the overnight shift. He was comfortable with silence, which meant he was comfortable with his own attention without needing to be managed. Caleb spent 4 weeks running Ortega through the building. Every system, every quirk, every known issue, and its status in the log. The mechanical room, the suppression lines, the stairwells, the elevator systems, the HVAC routing on 17 and 23, the access control integration that had finally been completed in the second week of October. He walked him through the shared log with security, introduced him to Deshawn, took him to meet Petra and her crew. He gave him his personal maintenance records, all 3 years of them, and told him to read them not as history, but as a map of how the building communicated its problems. Buildings talk, Caleb said, on the last night of the walkthrough, standing in the service corridor that ran along the east elevator bank. Not loudly. It's usually small things. A sound that's slightly different. A smell that's slightly off. A pressure reading that's 2% outside baseline. The job is learning the building's normal well enough that the not normal stands out. Ortega looked at him. How long does that take? Depends on how much attention you pay, Caleb said. For this building, I'd say 6 months before you really know it. A year before you stop being surprised by it. Ortega nodded. He looked down the corridor. Is there anything about this building you wish you'd known earlier? Caleb thought about it. That the people in it matter as much as the systems, he said. I spent a long time thinking if I kept the physical infrastructure right, that was the job. But the night everything actually went wrong, it wasn't about the infrastructure. It was about whether there was a person paying enough attention to act. He paused. The building can be perfectly maintained and still fail the people inside it if nobody's paying attention to what the people need. Ortega looked at him for a moment. That sounds like more than a facilities job. Yeah, Caleb said. It is. He clocked out for the last time as overnight maintenance staff on a Thursday in December at 6:19 in the morning. He signed the sheet, returned his overnight access key to the rack. He'd have a different key card in his new role, with different access levels, and stood in the maintenance office for a moment in the early quiet. The room looked the same as it always had. Damp walls, the smell of cleaner and metal, the bookshelves of binders organized by system and floor. The overhead light working correctly because he'd replaced the bulb himself on the morning of the first meeting. His personal maintenance log, now 3 volumes, sitting on the corner of the desk. He'd leave them for Ortega, who already knew they were there. He sat down for a minute, not doing anything in particular, just sitting in the room that had been his base of operations for 3 years, 2 months, and some number of days that he didn't bother to calculate because it didn't particularly matter. What mattered was what had happened in the room, and in the corridors outside it, and in the elevator shaft above the lobby, and in a stairwell on 9 to 11, and in a parking sublevel in November, and in an office on the 61st floor facing the river. He thought about the version of himself who had taken this job, who had driven here for the interview, sat in the lobby waiting to be called, looked at the marble floors and the polished reception desk and thought, this is fine, this is manageable, this is something I can do while I figure out the rest. He had not been wrong about any of that, but he had been wrong about the while, about the idea that this was a holding pattern, a pause, a quieter version of waiting to know what came next. It hadn't been a pause. It had been a different kind of work, in a different register, that had required him to learn different things. How to exist in a place without controlling it. How to see problems and work within the limits of what he could address. How to be useful without being the person in charge. How to be, more or less, a person, in an ordinary building, on an ordinary street, with ordinary frustrations and an extraordinary child at home who was watching everything. He was not the same person who had driven here for the interview. That was neither good nor bad. It was just true. He stood up, put on his jacket, and turned off the light. His first day in the new role was a Monday. He came in at 8:30, which was the strangest thing, walking into Meridian Tower at 8:30 in the morning with the lobby full of people arriving for the day, the elevators busy, the reception desk handling a queue. He had been in this lobby hundreds of times, but always at the margins of it, arriving as people left, leaving as people arrived, moving through the edges. Walking in at 8:30 felt like reading a sentence from a different direction. He had an office. It was not large. It was on the 23rd floor, a room that had previously been used for storage, which Renata had cleared and furnished with a desk and 2 chairs and a monitor and a phone. He didn't mind that it had been a storage room. He minded, briefly, that the overhead light had the same faint buzz as the one in the basement office, and then he found a replacement bulb in the facility's supply room and fixed it before he sat down, which took 4 minutes and which made him feel, unreasonably, that the space was his. The view from the 23rd floor faced south. He could see a different part of the city from this height, the older neighborhoods, the river bend further south, a patch of park between 2 commercial blocks that he hadn't known existed and that he looked at for a moment before getting to work. Victoria had sent him a list of 6 priority items to start with, drawn from the remaining 17 on the action plan. He read through them, then opened the building systems overview he'd drafted for the security cross-familiarization program, and started revising it for the expanded version, the one that would eventually go across the portfolio if Victoria approved the budget, which she had indicated she was likely to do. At noon he ate lunch at his desk, which was a sandwich from the cafeteria on 6 and a cup of coffee that was better than the maintenance break room coffee had ever been. He noted the improvement without making it into anything and kept working. At 3:45, his phone showed a text from the school. Eli is ready for pickup. He had arranged a neighbor, the same one from before, a retired woman named Alice who lived 2 floors up and charged $30 and was reliable. For the days his schedule ran long. Today, it didn't run long. He closed his laptop, took the elevator down, walked to the school, and was standing at the gate at 3:58 when Eli came through the doors. His son stopped when he saw him, which was not the rushing, backpack-bouncing approach of a normal day. He stopped and looked at his father standing at the school gate at 3:58 in the afternoon, and then he signed carefully the way he signed things that required accuracy. "You're here." "I'm here," Caleb signed back. "You're not supposed to be here. It's not Saturday. I have a new job. Different hours." Eli looked at him for a long moment with the particular seriousness that had no business being on an 8-year-old's face. He had turned 8 in October, the birthday party involving pizza and 4 of his school friends and a cake that Caleb had made himself from a mix, imperfectly, with the frosting slightly too thick on one side. "You'll be home at night?" he signed. "Most nights," Caleb signed. "Yeah." His son stood on the sidewalk outside his school in the December afternoon light and said nothing for a moment. He looked down at his shoes and then back up at his father, and his face did something complicated that Caleb recognized as the face of a person who has a large feeling and doesn't quite have the language for it yet, and who is also 8 years old and has learned from watching his father to be careful with large feelings in public. Then Eli signed with the particular private shorthand that only the 2 of them fully understood, the gesture for "I love you" that Caleb had never done in front of anyone else. And Caleb signed it back. And they walked home. They had pasta for dinner. The kind with cheese on top, because Eli requested it, and Caleb had bought the right cheese at the grocery store the previous weekend on the theory that he would probably be asked for it eventually. They ate at the kitchen table and Eli talked, in his usual unstoppable signing and speaking mix, about a project at school involving the water cycle and a disagreement he'd had with a classmate about whether clouds count as water or as air. Caleb gave his opinion on the cloud question, which Eli received with serious consideration and then rejected in favor of his own theory, which was more creative than accurate but showed good reasoning. After dinner, Eli did homework and Caleb cleaned up, and then they sat on the couch and watched 30 minutes of a nature documentary before Caleb told him it was time for bed, which was met with the standard resistance, which he managed with the standard firmness, and by 8:45 the apartment was quiet and Eli was asleep. Caleb sat in the kitchen with his coffee going cold, and the city outside making its nighttime sounds. Traffic, a distant siren, the particular ambient register of a city at rest, but not fully resting. And he thought about nothing in particular for a while, which was a thing he had gotten worse at over the years, and was slowly getting better at again. He was not a simple person, he knew that. He had been made complicated by things that had happened before this building and before this city and before Eli was born, things that had left marks he would carry for the rest of his life, whether he talked about them or not. He was not at peace with all of it, and he suspected he never entirely would be. And he had come to understand that peace was not actually the thing you were supposed to be aiming for. Peace was a state. What you were aiming for was a life that made use of who you were, all of who you were, including the parts that had been forged in circumstances you wouldn't choose again, towards something worth doing. He had spent 3 years being invisible, and it had served a purpose, and it was over now. He was not invisible anymore. He was not, by any reasonable measure, who he had been before. But he was not either the stripped-down functional version of himself he'd been running as a maintenance worker at midnight, trying to be small enough to stay safe. He was something in between those two things, something he didn't have a clean name for, which was fine. Most real things don't have clean names. The building, over those 3 years, had taught him something that he thought he'd already known and hadn't. Not really. That the systems people build to keep themselves safe are only as good as the people willing to maintain them honestly, not the people in the meetings or the people with the titles or the people whose names end up in the reports, though those people matter too. The people who walk the corridors at midnight and notice the sound that's slightly different and write it down and submit the report and write it again when nothing happens and keep writing it, not because anyone is watching, but because the building is full of people who don't know they're depending on someone to notice. That was, he thought, the real job. It had always been the real job. The title was just the building catching up. He picked up his phone and looked at the time. 9:17. He was not tired in the bone-deep way of a person who had been working against the clock. He was tired in the ordinary way of someone who had put in a full day and was done with it. He put the phone down. He finished his coffee cold, which was how he'd drunk it 100 nights in the maintenance office, and the familiarity of it was something close to comfort. Outside, Meridian Tower stood across the city the way it always had. 72 stories of glass and reinforced steel, all that accumulated weight of human ambition and poor maintenance decisions and elevator sensors that needed replacing and stairwells that needed lighting, and people who needed to know each other well enough to function together when things went wrong. It was not a perfect building. It never would be, because buildings, like people, are not repaired into perfection, but into better, more functional, more honest, more capable of surviving the next problem that comes along. 17 items had become 8 by December. 8 would become 3 by the new year. 3 would eventually become something else. New problems discovered, new systems installed, new failures waiting to be understood. That was the nature of the work. It didn't end. It evolved. Caleb Mercer was 37 years old and had been many things, and was now the head of facilities resilience and emergency preparedness at a company that had, 6 months earlier, not known what that role was or that it needed one. He had a son who was 8 and had strong opinions about clouds, and had turned the apartment into something that felt like a home, in the way homes only feel when someone is in them consistently enough to leave their actual shape on the place. He turned off this kitchen light. He checked the front door lock, an old habit, not compulsive, just attentive. He looked in on Eli, who was asleep with one arm thrown over the edge of the bed, and his face turned toward the window where the city's ambient light came in soft and gray, and who looked as he always did when he was sleeping, like the least complicated version of himself, which was an 8-year-old with his father's dark eyes and his own stubborn and wonderful brain. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about Marcus's letter, addressed to the building, which was the best he'd been able to do. He thought about Deshawn's text on the night of the procedural decision. Earned it, man. He thought about Holloway and the parking sublevel, watching Tron articulate the exact problem they'd all been failing to name. He thought about Eli, at the school gate, signing, "You're here," with the precision of someone marking a fact that had just changed. He turned away from the doorway. He went to his room. He set his phone on the nightstand and did not set an alarm because he did not need to be anywhere at midnight, and the particular freedom of that was still new enough to register. He slept. In the morning, he would go back to the building. He would ride the executive elevator to the 23rd floor, the elevator that now worked correctly, whose sensor had been replaced, and whose mechanical system he knew better than anyone else in the company. He would sit at a desk that had been a storage room and had a window that faced south and an overhead light that buzzed until he fixed it. He would work on the cross-portfolio training program and review the last 8 items on the action plan and meet with Holloway about the next crisis training session and call Petra's crew about the HVAC routing job on 17 that was scheduled for January. He would do all of that, and it would not be glamorous or dramatic, and nobody would sign a letter about it, and that was exactly right. The real work never is.